was in the early 90s. As usual, a small third grader, was sent to my grandparents' village for the summer. The village was not so shabby. Old wooden 2- and 3-story houses, a large yard, cows, chickens. The village stood on the bank of the river at the mouth of the White Sea. For the next 250 kilometers there is nothing. Wilderness is wilderness. But I went there with pleasure. There was no computer at that time, and here you can walk with the local gang. My grandmother and grandfather were also good, economic, lived relatively well, and we helped everyone. Grandfather lived like a czar. He had a snowmobile and a motorboat, which not every collective farmer had. He was a man with a capital letter, huge in stature, a fathom in his shoulders, wiry with a white-black beard and a loud bass. He did not look his 8th decade. He was also missing an eye. He had lost it in the war. On holidays, he looked like a Christmas tree in his jacket, covered in medals. He always sang songs and told jokes. So, as usual, grandfather decided to go to the taiga, and he took me to learn life, to fish, and set snares. We got on the boat in the morning, packed everything, my grandmother put food on it. It was a long way, a day's sail. The weather was perfect, mosquitoes did not bother us on the river. Grandfather kept joking about some fleshy tzatziki that I should grab when I saw the girl of my dreams. The old man got carried away. He'd rather tell me about the war, but he always avoided the subject, saying he didn't know those horrors. There were no traces of people on the shore. Only some barrels and logs along the shore. Sometime in the evening, we approached a big steep bend. On the high bank, we could see some old ruins. It was obvious that someone had lived here a long time ago. My grandfather became wary, saying that this place was dangerous and was called Dark Curtain. The weather, as if hearing my grandfather, changed abruptly. The rain started to pour, clouds came. The ripples on the water quickly turned into a pretty good bobbing. I was a kid. I didn't know how to swim and was afraid of it. I held on to my grandfather like a tree and asked him to dock. My grandfather kept silent and only increased speed on the motor. Further on, the wind became bolder. The boat was shaking only so much. The water was flooding the bottom. I began to cry. It was as if my soul became empty, and I was afraid of something unknown. Grandfather, though he was calm, but it was obvious that he was not himself either. We gave up trying to swim further, and we docked at the shore. It was necessary to hide from the rain and wind because in the distance we could see a mowed barn. Grandfather was already openly nervous. His one eye was running from side to side, and his hands were trembling. It was as if he wanted to say something, but he could not. We tied up the boat and headed for the barn. There was almost nothing inside. Old nets, empty tin cans, and a rusty shovel. Outside, a storm was already brewing. Grandfather spread a tarpaulin and took out a thermos to pour tea, but his hands were shaking. I was seriously worried. I started to ask him what was wrong, but he only mumbled something inaudible as I realized about the cursed place. Then he looked at me with wild fatigue. I had never seen such a look in my grandfather before, and said that he was not feeling well, and he would take a nap and then go on his way, and then the weather would subside. I put the gun beside him, loaded it beforehand, and told him not to go anywhere and to wake him up if anything happened. After a while, I was tired. I tried to stay awake. But instead, I fell into a kind of incomprehensible slumber. When I woke up, I didn't immediately realize that something had happened. There didn't seem to be a storm outside. It was night. Grandpa was lying as he was. I decided to wake him up, but I couldn't. Grandpa wasn't breathing. That's when I got panic. I was scared to death. Alone in the taiga, at night, Grandfather didn't react. Taking all my will in a fist, I decided to look for help. Having raised the gun, in case of wolves or something else, I ran to the boat. Here I realized that the space seemed to have changed. The sky glowed with purple light. There was no wind at all. The river was completely immobilized, and there was a smell of burning in my nose. No sounds were heard as usual. It all seemed like a real nightmare. Looking over the top of the bank, I saw a wooden church. I could have sworn it wasn't there during the day. There was a light on in the church. I ran there, dropping my gun. As I got closer, I heard voices. They were saying prayers. When I opened the door, I saw a multitude of people, women, children, old women, and men. They paid no attention to me. They were looking at the icon and praying. They looked strange. I had only seen such clothes in my grandmother's old family photos. Women wore scarves and dresses, children in shirts, men in black zaipuns. I started to ask them for help. Everyone turned around and looked at me. 2 women came up to me and took me by the arms. The men closed the door behind me with a deadbolt. I shouted, saying that my grandfather needed help, but they didn't listen. They led me to an icon and told me to pray. Their speeches had a strange effect on me, like hypnosis. I don't know why, but I started mumbling something about Jesus, though I had never even opened the Bible, forgot about my grandfather, and fell into a kind of oblivion. The women and old women began to say that we would all be in paradise, that God was waiting for us, and that the Antichrist would not get our souls. I didn't understand what was going on, and I didn't want to. People's words from prayers turned smoothly into sobs. Children began to scream. Men stood with stone faces, silently reciting a prayer. And then abruptly, there was a sepulchral silence. The door of the church began to be broken, each time more and more forcefully. I didn't know who was breaking in, but it was scary. Women and children screamed hysterically. The men were numb on the spot. One of them suddenly picked up a candle and decisively threw it at a pile of hay in the corner. Instantly, a fire started in the room. No one ran. They all looked at the spreading fire. And I realized that they had decided to burn themselves and me along with them. I thought about running away, but realized that the women had a firm grip on me. The fire was getting closer and closer, and people were burning and screaming. The door was barely holding against the onslaught of blows from outside. An inhuman fear gripped me. Fire, smoke, incomprehensible people who had decided to burn themselves and me alive. And the Antichrist was breaking into the church. I was beginning to faint. But then the door to the room was kicked in, and an incomprehensible huge creature came at me through the fire and smoke. Through my tears, I saw that he had a huge axe in his hand, and he was moving towards me. The hand swung in a blow, and I squeezed my eyes shut, ready to die. But then there was a blow, and something splashed. The daze was over. I opened my eyes and saw the dead old women holding me. Turning my head, I saw a man, covered in soot, with his one-eyed, scorched face contorted in wild rage, and with a bloody shovel in his hands stood my grandfather, taking me by the armpits and holding me to his chest. Saving me from the fire, he rushed out of the church, driving away the burning people surrounding us with the shovel. There was a roar. Antichrist. The ring of possessed people was tightening. Grandfather fought desperately. Seeing nothing, I heard the sound of the shovel crushing bones, and grandfather's powerful mat. Miraculously getting out of the church, grandfather ran with me to the shore, and I remembered nothing else. I woke up in the district center in the hospital. The nurse said that I had carbon monoxide poisoning and respiratory burns. I was found by fishermen in a boat 50 kilometers away from the Dark Curtain, unconscious and covered with a tarpaulin. A few days later, they found my grandfather. He was half lying, half sitting in the same place where I had left him before leaving the barn. No church was there, just long overgrown charred logs. The police from the district center didn't believe my story about the Dark Curtain, and neither did my parents. They wrote it off as shock. Only the district police officer and the fishermen who found me crossed their hearts. We took my grandmother with us from the village and buried my grandfather. When I grew up, my grandmother, almost at death, told a story about how the NKVD officers in the 20s wanted to take away from the taiga and culturally enlighten the local old believers, tried to take by force, but they locked themselves in their church and burned themselves alive, thinking that the Antichrist had appeared on earth. After putting out the fire and dismantling the ashes, they found a barely alive child. It was my grandfather. It was during my service in the far north. I once went on a business trip to a neighboring district, to the city of N. I went by my own car. I barely persuaded the commander, but I had no desire to shake on the train, and I wanted to turn around quickly. It was New Year's Eve. I worked, got ready for the return trip, and then, as luck would have it, the frost hit harder. By local standards, not to say that it was cold at all. Well, minus 30 degrees frost. Well, I think about 1,000 kilometers. Not very far. I have a good car. And I really want to go home. I poured coffee in thermos. Took sandwiches. There will be few objects of civilization in the form of cafes on the way. After all, the north. The road flowed smooth gray cloth among the vast white desert. The snowdrifts swept the roadside, and the dim northern sun still lifted the mood. They were already 200 kilometers behind. Suddenly the light bulb blinked. Gasoline is running out. I could not believe my eyes. At the exit from the city, I filled up a full tank. Fortunately, a few kilometers later, I saw a sign. A gas station in 1,000 meters. I thought again. On the way here. I had not noticed this gas station. The gas station appeared out of the frosty fog. The illumination was shining with blue light. The sign of a small store winked coquettishly with the image of a cup with coffee. Other than my car, there were no customers in the gas station. No wonder, in such a frost, normal people sit at home, I thought, and having inserted a gas gun into the tank, went to pay for fuel. The girl cashier amazed me with her pallor and mind-boggling manicure. Unimaginably long nails were painted with bright red varnish. Usually I don't pay attention to this, but here I noticed that the nail polish had a strange effect. The nails seemed wet. For some reason it made an unpleasant impression on me, and I put the fuel card on the table. I didn't put it in the cashier's hands. In order not to stare at the cashier's hands, I began to look through the assortment of the small store. After accepting payment, the girl handed me my card and a piece of paper. Please fill out a questionnaire. We don't have many customers today. So when you fill out the questionnaire, I will give you a discount. What discount? The payment has already been accepted, I thought, and began to refuse, referring to the fact that I was in a hurry to get home by daylight. For some reason, I was unpleasant to be in this room. I wanted to go out into the frosty air. The girl began to talk more insistently and tried to shove a piece of paper and a pen into my hands. At that moment, I was shivering all the way to the top of my head. For some reason, I left the offer unanswered and literally jumped out of the store. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't understand what was happening to me. Spilling drops of gasoline from the gun on myself, I slammed the cap on the tank, stumbled, climbed into the car, and locked the door for some reason. When I calmed down a little, I started the engine and drove out on the highway. In my rearview mirror, I saw the blue lights of a gas station and the girl cashier, who stood at the exit of the gas station and looked after me. She was without outerwear, wearing a light sweater, her long black hair fluttering in the angry north wind. Terror squeezed my heart, and I stepped on the gas and gripped the steering wheel. I dared not look back again. I'm a grown-up man, I thought. I was scared of a girl with fingernails. Nerves should be treated. So, arguing with myself, I got myself under control, and gradually my heart stopped beating like mad. And then, what the hell? The light bulb blinked. The same one. It can't be, I thought. Turning to the side of the road, I got out of the car, knelt down and carefully examined the body from all sides. I couldn't see any leaks anywhere. Everything was fine. I opened the hood and made sure everything was okay there, too. Where's the gasoline? I hadn't driven more than 5 kilometers since the gas station. I got in the car, puzzled by the oddity. I'm running out of gas. The gas station is 5 kilometers behind me. And then I realized I couldn't go back there. I just couldn't go back. I'll go forward. I decided. The more soon, there should be a small village on the way. There. And I'll sort it out. The winter day is short. The sun was already hanging a cloudy spot over the horizon when I saw her. She was standing at the exit of the gas station, the blue lights of the illumination illuminating her. A girl with black hair, dressed in a light sweater. I was afraid to take my eyes off the roadbed and look at her. My foot automatically sank the gas pedal to the floor, and I sped past those blue lights. What was that? was the thought in my head, and sweat was running down my back in sticky streams. And then I began to pray. Almost for the first time in my life. I did not pray in the hall. I prayed as I could, in my own words, out loud, and almost shouting. After 30 kilometers, the village appeared. I stopped on the roadside, opened a thermos, and began to drink a hot drink. I was glad to see the rare passers-by as if they were my relatives. Knowing that there was a gas station at the exit from the village, I drove forward. The gas station attendant, a local boy, was wrapped in the high collar of his greasy jacket. I got out of the car and asked him, about 40 kilometers from the settlement towards the town? And have they opened a new gas station? The kid stared at me in surprise and said what I already knew. There is no gas station there. The nearest gas station that way is in town, Urian itself. After filling up a full tank, I made it home by evening. The next year in the summer, I traveled that road again. With 2 coworkers, we were going to the town of N for work. After passing the village, I looked out of the car windows with fear, but to my luck, there was only northern summer landscape, no gas stations. It was a long time ago. I was 15 years old, and I was walking home from school. It was very late, and the streets were empty, which surprised me a little. My way from school was through the yards, and there were a lot of stories about them, and scary ones at that, about maniacs who killed their victims bloodily, using axes and clubs, and also about rabid dogs in the night, which tear to shreds the flesh of a man. But these are just stories invented by caring parents to avoid real problems on the heads of their young children. I did not believe in these stories for a long time, because my parents themselves said that it is just a fiction. So I was walking down the street, lit only by the faint light of a lone lamppost. I had nowhere to hurry, since my parents considered me independent, that they could even send me alone to the other side of the country without worrying. Thinking about it, I didn't even notice that I had walked halfway and was 4 meters to the lonely pole. And suddenly, among the bushes, I discerned either a dog or a person and decided to get closer. Finally, the faint light of the lantern gave me a glimpse of a woman. She was sitting with her back to me on her knees, with her arms wrapped around her body. I could hear the poor woman sobbing every 2 seconds. She was wearing clothes, a white dress to be exact, but ragged and tattered, very dirty, as was her hair. I was startled. Naturally, the woman reminded me of those creepy characters from horror movies. Knocked down and scared, I just wanted to get away before the woman noticed my presence. But my body wouldn't listen. Suddenly I changed my mind and decided to ask her what was wrong and what she was doing alone at this hour, crying. And I asked, to which only silence answered me. The woman also fell silent. I became very scared. She started to get up slowly, standing up so slowly and inanimate. Very strange. She turned around, her face disfigured, eyes so glassy, empty, but not scary, but sad, though dead. Her face was white. The mouth was sewn shut with red thread. The stomach was gaping with hundreds of knife cuts. I looked. I couldn't believe it. I wanted to scream now and run home, but to no avail. It was only now that I realized what it was like to be dug into the ground. And she stood there, as if waiting for an answer. I was very afraid, but something told me she wouldn't hurt me. And suddenly, she started crying. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, and I had a lump in my throat. I couldn't have felt more emotions in my life than I did at that moment. I felt sorry for her, even though I didn't even know why she was crying. Suddenly, I walked over to her and hugged her. I felt warm, a special warmth, like a mother's warmth, and I started crying myself. Suddenly, the woman whispered in my ear, "You'll be fine. Just have faith." And I blacked out, falling on the asphalt. The second day, I woke up in a hospital bed. My mother told me that she found me with my father on the grass under a bush. And then, for some reason, I was not afraid that I would be sent to a mental institution. I immediately told my mother about that woman in front of the doctors. Mom burst into tears, and after 10 minutes, told me that I actually saw my aunt, who was killed and sunk by a maniac when I was born, and that her baby was also